Well, when we all did our pre-season predictions, I don't think any of us would have had the combination of Manchester United in 13th, Spurs in 14th. The same can also be said for Bournemouth challenging for a Champions League spot. And even in our bold Premier League predictions section where Rob said that West Ham would challenge for the top four, Nottingham Forest as title contenders wasn't even a thought. And I have to say, to sort of balance that out a little bit, I'm pretty sure I had Forest going down in my pre-season predictions as well. So, a real surprise story for everybody, I think, this season.
Yeah, thanks for that, James. After telling people off camera that you weren't going to do it, that's fantastic. Obviously, Nuno Espirito Santo's team are third in the Premier League, and among the teams that are challenging for the Champions League places, let alone avoiding relegation. They were in relegation battles the last 2 seasons before the start of this season. So what has changed?
Bruce Schoenfeld spent transfer deadline day last week with Nottingham Forest sporting director Ross Wilson, as well as speaking to their striker Chris Wood and others at the club. Bruce, welcome back. What was it like spending transfer deadline day with Forest?
It was incredibly languid and relaxing, which, is unusual for any transfer day, but especially for Forest. They're usually in the midst of, the last of 22 signings or some incredible horde, and they were totally placid. They brought in one player, a young defender from Reading, who's going right back to Reading on loan, and all their business was done. And Ross had time to give me a nice leisurely tour of the facility.
Bruce, I mean, what they did on deadline days is a complete contrast to what they had done previously in their 2 years in the Premier League. I mean, they became almost like a figure of fun, didn't they, for the amount of signings that they were making, the amount of money that they were spending. Some of those signings that came in didn't last very long. I mean, what do you think that the biggest change has been in that kind of recruitment department and their approach to recruitment?
I think the big answer there is their work is done. It was absurd. They were like a poor man's Chelsea, grabbing everyone they could. To be fair, much of the squad that came up was on loan. So they not only did they not emerge in the summer of 2022 into the Premier League with a Premier League ready squad, they barely had a squad. So they did need to go out and sign players. They got some of those signings right, but most of them wrong. They fired a sporting director. Then they signed another bunch of guys in January. They fired another sporting director. Ross Wilson came in, but along the way, a piece here and a piece there, they've ended up with a nice little squad. A lot of players who are sort of on their second chance. Chris Wood, Callum Hudson-Odoi, players who are maybe didn't really succeed in their first time around and have something to prove. They have Ryan Yates, who's been there since he was a 7-year-old, and they've come together in a really nice way. And I think they felt their number one priority in the summer and even now in January was not to lose anybody. And apart from James Ward-Prowse going back, recalled to help West Ham make that top 4 push, they didn't lose anyone. So they counted that a big success. They also had the profit sustainability breach last year, a 4-point penalty, and I think at this point they're not out of the woods on that. So more signings were probably not prudent anyway.
I mean, their owner is quite an ebullient, larger-than-life character. I'm assuming he turned you down for an interview, but did you get a sense when you're at the club of his presence?
Absolutely. He did turn me down for an interview. His presence is, he's despotic. I mean, he runs it with an iron hand. Everything is subject to his will and whimsy. He's the one that okays all interview requests for everyone on the club. He sets the tone. But he also has been able to, I think, as he's done with Olympiacos as well, he has created this sort of this level of ambition, this level of not being satisfied with anything other than sort of world dominance, and it has suffused through the club. And you do have a club now that believes in itself and that believes that Nottingham Forest should be. That this Nottingham Forest club is heir to the club that won back-to-back European Cups under Brian Clough, and that's where they should be. And Marinakis firmly believes that, and he has everyone else believing it too, and that's half the battle.
James, I'll just come to you on Nuno, because obviously you will have dealt with Nuno when he was at Spurs. He's kind of had this, it's not an odd career, is it? But did so well at Wolves and got them into the Premier League and sustained them as a Premier League side. Got his big move to Tottenham, which clearly didn't work out. What were your memories of him at Tottenham? And have you been a little bit surprised that he's been able to kind of reinvent himself a little bit as a Premier League manager?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think most of us who covered Spurs during that period would never have really seen him reinventing himself. Well, I mean, he's not really reinventing himself. He's just kind of found a better fit for his style of football and his methodology, I think. I think from the Tottenham sort of episode, there were some things that were out of his control. I think that if you go back to the way that Spurs went about their managerial search that summer, they botched it, really. I think he was about the 7th or 8th choice for that job. And the players knew it. And that put him on the back foot from day one. He also inherited a situation where Harry Kane had publicly said that he wanted to join Manchester City. That obviously went on the whole summer. Kane tried to force through that move. He was late coming back for pre-season. And I think that kind of, again, it all sort of plays into the idea of a manager trying to come in and really assert his authority and make his mark on a squad. It was difficult for him. But I think having said that, I remember at the time there were certain issues around discipline. There were players who were getting punished internally for travelling when they weren't given permission to do so, to go away with their countries. There were issues really around communication. I mean, his press conferences, I think, are better now, but they were really bad then. It was hard, pulling teeth, trying to get him to really explain anything. And I think the scale of the job and the size of the task maybe, and just the level of scrutiny that he had at Tottenham, probably he wasn't quite ready for it. Whereas I think at Forest, obviously historically, one of English football's biggest clubs, but he's not going to get the same level of scrutiny at Forest as he did at Spurs. And I think that's probably helped him just to kind of settle in and just establish himself. And the brand of football really wasn't great at Spurs either. I mean, they were shot shy. They didn't defend well. They showed no ambition. And this whole issue of sort of to dare is to do, they were a mile away from it. He inherited obviously a squad that was sort of built in a quite conservative fashion from the Jose Mourinho period. And really, I think Spurs were in a sort of situation where they didn't quite know who they wanted to be. And Nuno didn't have either the strength of character or the experience to be able to get them out of that. So I think seeing what he's done now, a club where, as I say, slightly less profile, slightly less scrutiny, players who are kind of more ready to be moulded into a sort of safety first kind of approach, I think has really helped see the best of him. And really now he's really redefined his reputation in England as a result.
Forest probably deserve a lot of credit for that, don't they? Because I think we've talked on the pod before about how easy it is for clubs when they're looking for new managers to kind of dismiss managers who have failed elsewhere, that you kind of tainted that reputation and that they go and look for a different fit somewhere else. But you said there right at the start of the answer that the managers who do the best at clubs are the best fit. And Forest have obviously looked beyond what he did at Spurs. The fact that he had to go to Saudi Arabia to kind of rebuild his career a little bit and pick someone who is the right fit. And at Spurs, he became a little bit of a figure of fun again, didn't he? But I've seen stats this year about the number of in-game tactical changes that Nuno has made in games, and it's among the highest in the league. That is a manager who knows a system and has got the best out of a system, but also knows that he's capable of making those tactical tweaks during games to get the best out of players, in difficult situations. And I think Forest deserve an awful lot of credit for that, because it would have been very easy when they sacked Steve Cooper to look elsewhere and not want to go and bring Nuno back from Saudi Arabia. But obviously they chose to do that, and it's worked out fantastically well.
Yeah, and I think there's a clarity about Forest. I mean, as Bruce sort of alluded to earlier, there's clearly one man calling the shots, whereas at Spurs that wasn't the case. I think I'm reminded of Tanguy Ndombele's experience where he was offered to Lyon as they were trying to sign Houssem Aouar that summer, And then Ndombele, as a result of that, told Spurs he wanted to leave. A deal failed to materialise, and then suddenly Ndombele was playing. He played sort of 6 out of 7 games from kind of mid-September onwards in that season under Nuno. And you sort of think, well, he's been handed a hospital pass of a situation there, which is that Spurs have tried to get this player out. The players then sort of said, well, I don't want to play for the club. They've botched the move, and then suddenly Nuno's got to, reintegrate this player, who was then, by the way, their club record signing, and try and make it work. And whereas it feels as though he's come into a setup at Forest where there's a much greater clarity of vision, of voice, and that he's given this squad, and I'm not saying he doesn't have influence over some of the player recruitment stuff, because I'm sure he does, but it just feels as though it's as Bruce sort of said, earlier in Forest's journey, they've been through the churn, they've been through the kind of high turnover of players, that they've actually got themselves into a position now where it's relatively settled. And I think Nuno's come into that and made the most of it.
I think it's interesting to point out that he's still playing the same kind of football. And I think when he was hired, it was seen as a really good choice for a team that wanted to finish 13th and 14th as opposed to 17th and go through the relegation battle. And I think he was a very safe, very smart choice for that. But when you look at how they play, which, I mean, it's almost like they play like they're a man down. They sit back, they wait to counter, they're happy to not have the ball. They've had the ball, a very small percentage of the time all year long. In the 7-0 win against Brighton, they were almost outpossessed 2/3. I think it was 63-37. It's hard to score 7 goals when you only have the ball 37% of the time. But when you look at how they play compared to the other clubs at the top of the table, it's absolutely different. When what Liverpool has done with this really complicated, elegant possession style with Pep and Man City, Game Week trying to do the same thing, with Arsenal and Arteta playing a modification of that style, even Chelsea. I mean, what Forest is doing is an absolute diametric opposition to what everyone else is doing, but they're not in 14th. Somehow they're in 3rd. It's really amazing.
Bruce, what do you see as their major challenges from this point? Obviously, there's still a fair chunk of this season left. There is the chance now that they are going to play European football next season, a good chance. When teams play well, heavy hitters start to circle for your best players. How difficult do you think it's going to be to turn this from a fantastic one-off season into kind of a sustained top 10, top 6, challenging for European places? How tough is that going to be, do you think?
I think it's going to be very hard. And, European football first is a bit of a booby trap, especially for a very tight-knit small squad like this one. You look at what happened to Aston Villa, which, granted, they were in the Conference League last year, but kind of did that with their left hand and concentrated on a top 4 finish, attained a top 4 finish. And this year, they've just not been able to adapt to playing midweek football week after week, very difficult games, Champions League games, and then coming back on the Sunday. They've won 1 game out of the 8 on the weekend following their Champions League midweek matches. And I think and it's almost a given now that Forest will have European football, I think they're going to find that very difficult. And as you alluded to, a lot of these players have now made a name for themselves. And even if, Marinakis is he's a wealthy man, but he's determined, I'm not going to sell. It's very hard to tell some of these players, especially the younger ones, Arsenal's interested, but we want you to stay here. Well, Arsenal's Arsenal, for all their troubles, Man U is still Man United. And the prospect of playing at Old Trafford, wearing that kit, I mean, that's an enticing one for players. It's hard to keep them in Nottingham. It will be hard, and just the dynamics of the Premier League are still weighted toward the Big Six. Their revenues are so much higher. Their fan base is so much higher. Their game day income, everything they do is just so much greater that it's much easier for a club like that in the club in the Big Six to come back. You saw Man City. I mean, it on a window where Forest didn't do anything, Man City spent £200 million or £180 million. And that's something that it's just going to be hard to match on a sustained level. So I do think, I mean, and there is an appreciation. I talked to Ryan Yates and he was very, he politely fielded all the questions about Europe, about the Champions League, maybe even catching Liverpool. But his basic feeling was, hey, we're doing this now, and let's not race over that. And I think his feeling, and maybe Nuno's as well, is if this is a one-off, let's make the most of it. Let's enjoy it. Let's see what we can do, and then we'll worry about tomorrow. I don't know if Marinakis has that perspective, but I think the people in the club who are making this happen appreciate what an incredible achievement it's been, whatever happens from here. And that's, in a way, that's the most endearing thing about them. They're even as their owner is going on and on about how this is a team that should be challenging, should be one of the biggest clubs in the world. Nottingham Forest is a long way from being one of the biggest clubs in the world, and they know it. And it's fun to see a club like that where they are.
I think you're right to point out that the stress that will be placed on Forest's recruitment in the next few years is probably one of the key things that they're going to have to deal with, because we saw it with Leicester that, Leicester obviously won that title out of nowhere. It's referenced in your piece that's on ESPN.com. Sustained that kind of level for a little bit. They were in and around the Champions League places. They won a Community Shield. I think they won an FA Cup. But when you start to lose players, the emphasis on the recruitment department to continually replace those players year after year after year is so tough, because it's just, there is no, for those clubs like Leicester and Forest, similarly, Brentford, Bournemouth, Brighton, there is no margin for error with their recruitment. And if you get a couple of windows wrong, then suddenly, instead of sort of bouncing around 6th and 7th, you're looking at 16th, 17th. I mean, I referenced kind of Brentford there. Brentford are kind of held up as this kind of, beacon of hope for the rest of the Premier League, but they finished 16th in the Premier League last year. They weren't particularly close to getting relegated, but they were on the cusp at some stage of the season. We've seen Leicester have obviously been relegated and now trying to rebuild. That if you were Forest and there are big clubs circling the likes of Hudson-Odoi, Elanga, Milenkovic, Murillo, it's incredibly tough to keep going back to the well to find players to replace those. And I think I've said on the pod before that I think the Premier League has shown that there is an opportunity for those clubs to kind of challenge the established top six, particularly when you're not playing European football, to have a really great season, but to have a sustained, 5-10 year spell where you're in and around those teams is really, really tough. And it would only take a couple of poor windows to have a team like, Forest or Brighton or Brentford to be sort of 16th, 17th. And then once you get relegated, it's kind of anyone's game. Then it's really, really tough to get back. I think you're right in what you said. It's great that Forest are there, and I'm sure that their fans that are looking at this is, it's what a fantastic ride. The future, though, there are kind of potholes, aren't there, in the future, possibly what may happen if this carries on.
I don't even know if you have to have particularly poor windows to not sustain it. I mean, if you're Leicester, you woke up one day and N'Golo Kanté is one of the best players in the world, and Mahrez is Mahrez, and it's just not sustainable for those players to stay in Leicester. Well, where do you go find another N'Golo Kanté? And I don't think there's anyone at that level right now at Forest, but Murillo's and Danilo, and these are, and what Hudson-Odoi has evolved into. These are mainstay Premier League players who I don't know if they start at Big Six clubs, apart of course from Tottenham, where I think you and I could step in this weekend unless they get their players back. But I think those are players that belong on the squad, anywhere in the world. I don't know how, no matter how good your recruitment is, and Ross Wilson's very good, I don't know how you just go find another one. It's really, really tough.
The one I would point to is always Calvin Phillips at City. City signed Calvin Phillips at Leeds, who was one of the best midfielders in the league at Leeds. They signed him as a backup to Rodri for £40 million. It didn't work. And now he's been cast off on loan at Ipswich. teams like, again, Forest, Brighton, Brentford, they can't swallow that kind of expenditure. They can't just kind of go, oh, never mind, that didn't work, on to the next one. And there is just no margin for error. James.
Well, you look at
you
look at the role Jack Grealish was playing at Villa, and then what happened when he went to City, and I think that's the cautionary tale. And everybody ended up losing there, right? I mean, Villa, although they parlayed that into a sustainability and going out because Monchi's the best, going out and getting more talent, but they lost a flagship player, a seminal player. City spent a lot of money and got very little in return. And poor Jack Grealish went from being the hero of his boyhood club and his boyhood city to being on the outside, at a club that has a parade of world-class internationals. And that, I think, is the flaw in the current system. And it's exactly what Forest is going to be up against in the coming years. It's really hard.
Grealish has won the treble, I would just say. I think he's done all right out of it. But I get what you're saying. I mean, the thing is, PSR is one of those that it introduces a margin of error for everybody, doesn't it? It's just that it's bigger for the bigger clubs because they have the more revenue.
Right.
I'm sort of interested, Bruce, by obviously Forest are one of the few clubs who've been actually punished by these PSR rules. I mean, did you get a sense when you were with them that still hangs over them? I know you sort of mentioned it may be still a factor, but I mean, how much of a factor will it be this summer in the market for them? Will it, will there be PSR constraints that will stop them building on this season in the market? Are they going to have to sell again, or where are they at?
Yeah, I think this summer will be hard. Next summer will be better if they get Champions League money. But their problem is revenue. It's just so small compared with the bigger clubs. And as you know, PSR isn't just player salaries versus expenditures. It's revenue of all kinds. And that's where they really lag. And I think more likely they're going to end up selling some players for a lot of money. So they should be okay with PSR. But I do think it's, going forward, it makes it harder and harder for owners. And I know Wes Edens at Aston Villa has been eloquent about this. Hey, we're here and we want to spend money. We want to do it the right way. And the rules are constraining us from trying to keep up with the clubs that we are fighting against for positions. Well, that is a multiple of that is what's going to constrain Nottingham Forest. They just can't generate enough revenue to be in the world marketplace at a high enough level and keep their top players. They can't do all of that. Something's going to have to give.
Bruce, and just to wrap up on Forest, they've got, I think, Fulham, Newcastle, Arsenal and Man City all in the next 4 games. So in the short term, it's obviously a tough run. But looking beyond that, if they were to qualify for Europe next year, whether it's the Champions League or the Europa League, what does their, I suppose, next season look like, and what are they hoping to achieve in the next sort of 5-10 years?
Well, when you say they, there's Marinakis and then there's everyone else. I think what Marinakis is hoping to achieve is to win the Champions League. And he just won't be satisfied. I was talking with a couple of executives, and they said, he doesn't. If we draw, even on the road, we come back. He's not happy. There's no such thing as a positive draw, let alone a positive loss. He's live and die with every outcome. And on the one hand, that again can help motivate a club, but on the other hand, it's wearing. It's hard to have no margin of error, that that you'll have the wrath of the owner if with one bad result. But he wants Nottingham Forest to regain its place in the pantheon of English and world football. Throughout the club, I think everyone is happy being in the conversation, whether that means challenging Liverpool. And again, let's not forget the good fortune they've had. In any of the past few years, you'd have City running away with it, Liverpool chasing them, Arsenal chasing them, probably Chelsea or Spurs or Villa putting together a more consistent season. And you'd have Forest in a, 7th, 6th, right there with a few other clubs. everything has broken perfectly for them this year, with apart from Liverpool being so dominant, and that has them, right in the thick of things in a way that you can't count on in years to come. So, Ryan Yates put it well. He said, we can't control anybody else's results. All we can do is keep trying to play at a high level and see where that takes us. If that takes us to Europe, that's great. If it takes us to the Champions League, wow, even better. But even if it doesn't, we're doing something special here, and the week-to-week results are showing it. Now that, how long they can sustain that, I think is going to be the question. And I think it's a question not just for Forest, but it does sort of speak to how the Premier League is set up right now, and whether this is almost a test case for whether a club that is built like this, of this size, with this sort of construct, can sustain it. And it'll be interesting to see.